The radio crackled with static across the Afghan mountains. Then silence. Complete, suffocating silence, where enemy chatter had been constant for weeks. In the Tactical Operations Center at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, hardened soldiers exchanged glances. They knew what that silence meant. Someone had just whispered a name that made insurgent commanders order immediate radio blackouts across 3 provinces. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. That name belonged to Lieutenant Patricia Chen, a soft-spoken intelligence analyst who weighed barely 110 pounds and looked like she belonged in a university library rather than a war zone. But appearances, as the enemy had learned the hard way, could be devastatingly deceiving. The relentless sun hammered down on Forward Operating Base Sentinel like a bronze fist. Heat shimmered off the concrete barriers, turning the compound into a furnace that trapped dust, diesel fumes, and the perpetual tension of men and women living too close to death for too long. In the sprawling maze of prefab buildings and hardened bunkers, the intelligence support activity occupied the most fortified corner, a testament to how valuable and vulnerable the people inside truly were. Lieutenant Patricia Chen sat hunched over 3 glowing monitors in the ISA's main analysis room, her slight frame nearly swallowed by an oversized chair designed for much larger operators. At 26, she possessed the kind of quiet intensity that made her nearly invisible in a room full of alpha personalities. Her black hair was pulled back in a regulation bun that somehow made her look even younger than her years. Wire-rimmed glasses reflected the endless stream of data flowing across her screens. Intercepts, satellite imagery, pattern analysis, the digital footprints of an enemy that preferred to remain in the shadows. Around her, the ISA hummed with the controlled chaos of modern warfare's nerve center. Banks of computers processed terabytes of intelligence data. Secure phones rang constantly. Analysts called out updates on enemy movements, weapons caches, high-value targets. It was a world where information moved at light speed and lives hung in the balance of split-second decisions. But in this temple of electronic warfare, Patricia might as well have been a ghost. "Hey, numbers," called out Staff Sergeant Mike Reeves from across the room, using the call sign that had followed Patricia since her first week at Sentinel. "Got any magic math tricks to find those missing RPGs, or should we just assume they're hiding behind your calculator?" The comment triggered a ripple of snickers from the other analysts. Numbers. The name wasn't meant as a compliment. In a community where call signs like Reaper and Havoc carried weight and respect, being dubbed Numbers was the equivalent of being permanently benched. It suggested someone who dealt in abstractions rather than realities, spreadsheets rather than battlefields, theory rather than blood and bullets. Patricia didn't look up from her screen. Her fingers continued their steady dance across the keyboard, pulling together fragments of intercepted communications, cross-referencing them with known insurgent cell structures, building a picture that others couldn't see. She'd learned long ago that defending herself only encouraged more ridicule. Better to let her work speak for itself, even if no one was listening. Major David Harrison, the ISA's commanding officer, strode into the analysis room with the purposeful gait of a man accustomed to urgent decisions. At 42, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd earned his position through a combination of battlefield experience and political savvy. His uniform was always immaculate, his bearing always commanding. He was exactly the kind of officer who looked the part, tall, square-jawed, with the kind of presence that filled a room. "All right, people, listen up," Harrison announced, his voice cutting through the ambient chatter. "We've got movement in Sector 7, multiple sources reporting unusual activity around the old Soviet mine complex. I need a full workup on potential targets in that area within the hour." The room erupted into focused activity. Analysts began pulling up maps, satellite feeds, and historical data on the mine complex. It was the kind of urgent task that separated the elite from the ordinary, where careers could be made or broken based on who delivers actionable intelligence first. Patricia's screens showed something the others had missed. While they focused on the mine complex itself, she'd been tracking a much subtler pattern, a series of seemingly unrelated communications intercepts from the past 2 weeks. Coded references to the old bird's nest and counting eggs before sunrise. Individually, they meant nothing, but Patricia had spent months building a database of linguistic patterns used by this particular insurgent cell. She recognized the metaphors. "Major Harrison," she said, her voice barely audible above the room's activity. He didn't hear her, or chose not to. "Major?" she tried again, a little louder. This time, Harrison glanced in her direction with the expression of someone interrupted by a child tugging on their sleeve. "What is it, Lieutenant?" "Sir, I don't think they're at the mine complex. The intercepts I've been tracking suggest they're using it as a diversion. The real activity is at the old irrigation station about 3 clicks northeast. They've been referring to it in code for—" "Lieutenant Chen," Harrison cut her off with the tone of someone explaining something to a slow student, "we have confirmed human intel placing insurgent leadership at the mine complex. Satellite imagery shows increased foot traffic. 3 separate assets have reported unusual activity. What you have are, what, code words that might mean something?" The room had gone quiet. Everyone was watching now, some with amusement, others with the mild embarrassment of witnessing someone being publicly dressed down. Patricia felt heat creep up her neck, but her voice remained steady. "Sir, respectfully, the pattern analysis shows—" "Numbers," Sergeant Reeves interrupted with a laugh that wasn't entirely unkind. "Maybe stick to counting things and let the grown-ups handle the guesswork about what those counts might mean." More laughter. Patricia's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She turned back to her screens, but Harrison wasn't finished. "Lieutenant, I appreciate your enthusiasm for your analytical methods, but in the real world, we base operations on concrete intelligence, not statistical speculation. Focus on providing support for the actual mission, not chasing ghosts in the data." He turned away, effectively dismissing her. The room's attention shifted back to the mine complex. Patricia stared at her monitors, watching the data that told a completely different story. The irrigation station coordinates glowed on her screen like an accusation. She'd run the analysis 3 times, cross-referenced it with historical patterns, verified it against intercepted communications from similar operations. The math was perfect, the logic was unassailable, and absolutely no one cared. Around her, the ISA prepared for what they believed would be a significant operation against insurgent leadership. Maps were updated, drone assets repositioned, strike packages prepared. The confidence in the room was palpable. This was the kind of intelligence coup that made careers and earned commendations. They were about to take down a high-value target based on solid, traditional intelligence gathering. Patricia saved her analysis to her personal files and closed the screens. She'd learned that being right when everyone else was wrong wasn't a victory, it was a liability. In a world where perception often mattered more than reality, being the person who consistently questioned conventional wisdom made you either a visionary or a problem. And visionaries, she'd discovered, were rarely appreciated until after they'd been proven right. The operation would launch at dawn. By tomorrow afternoon, they'd know whether the insurgent leadership was really at the mine complex or if Patricia's pattern analysis had identified something everyone else had missed. But regardless of the outcome, she knew her position in the hierarchy wouldn't change. She'd remain numbers, the quiet analyst who dealt in abstractions while others handled the real work of war. What Patricia didn't know was that halfway across the valley, in a cave system near the irrigation station she'd identified, insurgent commanders were already planning their response to what they believed would be another failed American operation. They'd grown confident in their ability to outmaneuver the foreign invaders, to stay one step ahead of their technology and intelligence. That confidence would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. Dawn broke over the Afghan mountains with the deceptive beauty that preceded most catastrophes. Patricia Chen stood alone on the ISA building's reinforced rooftop, watching through binoculars as helicopters lifted off from the flight line like mechanical vultures against the salmon-colored sky. The strike package bound for the mine complex carried the hopes of an entire forward operating base and the certainty of failure that only she seemed to perceive. Her tablet displayed the real-time feed from the operation. Radio chatter crackled through her earpiece as the assault teams approached their target. Professional voices coordinated the dance of modern warfare. Air support, ground teams, drone surveillance, all converging on what intelligence had determined was a critical insurgent stronghold. Eagle Flight, this is Overwatch. The target building is cold. No movement, no heat signatures. Patricia's grip tightened on the binoculars. The mine complex was exactly as empty as her analysis had predicted. While 60 American soldiers prepared to raid a decoy location, the real insurgent cell was 3 kilometers away, probably watching the entire operation unfold through their own surveillance equipment. Breach teams, you are green to proceed. She closed her eyes, knowing what came next. The frustration in the voices as they cleared building after building of nothing but dust and old Soviet mining equipment. The embarrassment of Major Harrison as he explained to his superiors how solid intelligence had led to such a complete failure. The questions about how the enemy had known to evacuate, the suspicions of leaks and compromised assets. What they wouldn't discuss was the alternative analysis that sat ignored in Patricia's personal files. The pattern recognition algorithm she'd developed in her spare time, the linguistic database she'd built by hand, the mathematical model that could predict insurgent behavior with an accuracy rate approaching 90%. Because Patricia Chen wasn't just an intelligence analyst. She was a weapons-grade intellectual whose true capabilities had been systematically overlooked and underutilized by a military system that valued conventional thinking over revolutionary insight. The truth was that Patricia had graduated summa cum laude from MIT with dual degrees in mathematics and computer science before she'd turned 22. Her senior thesis on predictive modeling using linguistic pattern analysis had caught the attention of several 3-letter agencies, but Patricia had chosen military service instead. She believed in serving something larger than herself, in using her abilities to protect the people who couldn't protect themselves. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. What she hadn't anticipated was how thoroughly the military would waste those abilities. Her personal laptop, hidden beneath regulation manuals and intelligence reports in her footlocker, contained work that would have made her a fortune in the civilian world. Predictive algorithms that could identify market trends months in advance. Pattern recognition software that could detect fraud in real time across massive datasets. Machine learning models that could optimize everything from supply chains to urban traffic flow. But here at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, she was numbers, the quiet analyst who got coffee for the real intelligence professionals. The failed mine complex operation would officially be blamed on rapidly changing enemy patterns and the fluid nature of asymmetric warfare. Unofficially, it would be attributed to the inherent difficulty of fighting an enemy that melted away like smoke whenever American forces approached. No one would examine Patricia's alternative analysis because no one believed it could be valid. After all, if her methods were really superior, wouldn't someone have noticed by now? The answer was both simpler and more complex than anyone realized. Patricia's approach required a fundamental shift in how intelligence was gathered and processed. Instead of relying on human intelligence sources and traditional surveillance methods, she built comprehensive behavioral models based on communications patterns, timing analysis, and linguistic evolution. She treated insurgent cells like complex adaptive systems that could be understood mathematically rather than organizationally. Her algorithms didn't just track what the enemy was doing, they predicted what the enemy would do next based on hundreds of variables that human analysts couldn't possibly process simultaneously. Weather patterns, local economic conditions, historical precedents, religious observances, social media trends, commodity prices. Her models incorporated data streams that traditional intelligence gathering ignored completely. The irrigation station operation she'd identified wasn't just educated guesswork. It was the mathematical certainty of a system that had correctly predicted insurgent behavior in dozens of scenarios that never made it to operational planning because no one bothered to verify her work. 3 weeks earlier, Patricia had identified the planning phase of what would eventually become the mind complex deception. Her algorithms had detected subtle changes in communication patterns suggesting a disinformation campaign. She'd traced the linguistic markers through intercepted transmissions, identified the key nodes in the deception network, and mapped the probable true target locations. She'd presented her findings to Sergeant Reeves, who dismissed them as math homework. She'd tried to explain the methodology to her immediate supervisor, Captain Jennifer Walsh, who'd suggested Patricia focus on more practical applications of her analytical skills. She'd even attempted to brief Major Harrison directly, only to be told that her theoretical models weren't suitable for operational planning. What none of them understood was that Patricia's theoretical models were based on more comprehensive data analysis than the entire ISA had ever attempted. While they relied on a handful of human intelligence sources and occasional signals intercepts, Patricia had built a database of over 50,000 insurgent communications, cross-referenced with weather data, economic indicators, social patterns, and historical precedents going back 15 years. Her laptop contained terabytes of information that she'd collected, processed, and analyzed during countless off-duty hours. She'd written custom software to parse communications in 4 different languages, created algorithms to identify speaker patterns and organizational structures, built predictive models that could forecast insurgent activity with the precision of a weather forecast. The mind complex failure was entirely preventable. So was the ambush 2 weeks earlier that had cost 3 American lives. So was the IEB attack that had destroyed a supply convoy and wounded 8 soldiers. Patricia's models had identified the precursor patterns for all of these events, but her warnings had been systematically ignored. Not because they were wrong, but because they challenged the established methods and assumptions of people who'd built their careers on traditional intelligence gathering. Patricia closed her laptop and secured it in her footlocker beneath a stack of regulation manuals. Outside, the failed raid team was returning to base, their helicopters dark shapes against the brightening sky. In a few hours, there would be debriefings and after-action reports. Questions about how solid intelligence had led to such complete failure. Discussions about improving human intelligence networks and upgrading surveillance capabilities. There would not be any examination of Patricia's alternative analysis. There would not be any interest in her predictive models or pattern recognition algorithms. There would not be any acknowledgement that a different approach might have prevented the waste of resources and the missed opportunity to disrupt actual insurgent operations. Because acknowledging Patricia's capabilities would require admitting that the entire intelligence apparatus at Forward Operating Base Sentinel was operating with the effectiveness of a 19th century army trying to fight a 21st century war. What they didn't know was that Patricia had already moved beyond theoretical models. While they focused on yesterday's intelligence, she was building tomorrow's solutions. Her algorithms weren't just predicting insurgent behavior. They were identifying patterns that could be disrupted, communication networks that could be compromised, leadership structures that could be targeted with surgical precision. She wasn't just analyzing the enemy. She was learning to think like them, to anticipate their moves, to identify their weaknesses with mathematical certainty. And in the mountains of Afghanistan, where the enemy had grown confident in their ability to outmaneuver American intelligence, Patricia's true capabilities were about to transform from hidden strength into devastating reality. The insurgent commanders who had successfully deceived the mind complex operation had no idea they were being studied by an analytical system more sophisticated than anything they could imagine. They celebrated their tactical victory while Patricia's algorithms mapped their celebration patterns, analyzed their communication methods, and built predictive models for their next operation. They thought they were fighting against traditional military intelligence. What they were actually facing was the mathematical equivalent of a chess grandmaster who could see 30 moves ahead and had memorized every game ever played. Patricia understood something that no one else at Forward Operating Base Sentinel had yet realized. Modern warfare wasn't just superior firepower or better tactics. It was about superior information processing. And in that arena, she wasn't just competitive, she was in a league entirely by herself. The question wasn't whether she could revolutionize intelligence gathering and operational planning. The question was whether anyone would listen before more American soldiers died from preventable attacks. But as Patricia would soon discover, sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with the willingness to trust unconventional wisdom in the face of conventional failure. And sometimes the greatest victories come not from being right, but from being right at exactly the moment when being wrong is no longer an acceptable option. The failed mine complex operation was about to become the catalyst that would transform Patricia Chen from numbers into something far more dangerous, a woman whose analytical capabilities could no longer be ignored, dismissed, or underestimated. Because in war, mathematical certainty tends to trump institutional arrogance, and Patricia's mathematical certainty was about to collide with an enemy that had grown dangerously overconfident in their ability to stay one step ahead of American intelligence. That collision would change everything. The after-action briefing for Operation Drywell took place in the ISA's secure conference room, a windowless bunker where fluorescent lights cast everything in the sickly pallor of institutional disappointment. Major Harrison sat at the head of a scarred metal table, his usually immaculate uniform showing the strain of explaining a complete intelligence failure to his superiors. Around him, the ISA senior analysts shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, each privately grateful they hadn't been the primary architect of the mine complex debacle. Patricia entered quietly, taking her usual seat in the back corner where she could observe without drawing attention. She carried a manila folder containing her irrigation station analysis, the same report that had been dismissed 3 days earlier and validated 12 hours later when drone surveillance finally confirmed significant insurgent activity at the exact coordinates she'd identified. "Let's be clear about what happened," Harrison began, his voice carrying the controlled tension of a man whose career had just taken a significant hit. "Our intelligence was solid. Multiple human sources, satellite confirmation, signals intercepts, everything pointed to the mine complex as a high-value target. The fact that it turned out to be a deception operation reflects the enemy's sophistication, not our methodology." Captain Jennifer Walsh, Patricia's immediate supervisor, nodded emphatically. "The insurgents are clearly evolving their operational security. They're using more sophisticated deception techniques than we've seen before. We need to adapt our approach accordingly." Patricia opened her folder and glanced at the timestamps on her analysis. She'd identified the deception markers 18 days before the operation. Her algorithms had flagged the linguistic patterns suggesting a disinformation campaign 22 days ago. The mathematical models had predicted the mine complex would be empty with 94.7% certainty based on communication pattern analysis conducted 3 weeks prior to the raid. None of this information appeared in the official after-action report. "Sir," Patricia said, raising her hand slightly. Harrison's eyes found her with the expression of someone discovering an unwelcome insect. "Yes, Lieutenant. I have the analysis that identified the irrigation station as the actual target, the same analysis that predicted the mine complex would be empty. Perhaps we could review the methodology to improve future operations?" The room went dead quiet. Sergeant Reeves cleared his throat uncomfortably. Captain Walsh stared at her hands. The other analysts suddenly found their notebooks fascinating. Harrison's jaw worked silently for several seconds before he responded. "Lieutenant Chen, I thought we discussed this. Your theoretical approach doesn't constitute actionable intelligence. The fact that insurgents happen to be at a different location doesn't validate your methodology." "Sir, respectfully, it wasn't a coincidence. The algorithm identified specific deception markers in the intercepted communications. The pattern analysis showed numbers," Reeves interrupted, using her call sign like a verbal slap. Maybe save the math lecture for college. We're trying to figure out real solutions here. Patricia felt heat rise in her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. This is a real solution. The predictive model correctly identified insurgent behavior. If we'd followed the analysis, we could have disrupted their actual operations instead of… Instead of what? Harrison's voice had turned cold. Instead of following proven intelligence methodology that's worked for decades? Instead of trusting human intelligence sources who risk their lives to provide information? Instead of relying on satellite confirmation and signals intercepts that form the backbone of modern intelligence gathering? The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Patricia realized she wasn't just questioning the mind complex operation. She was challenging the fundamental assumptions underlying the entire intelligence apparatus. And in a military culture built on hierarchy and proven procedures, that made her something far more dangerous than wrong. It made her insubordinate. "Lieutenant," Captain Walsh said, in the tone of someone trying to defuse a bomb, "perhaps you could focus your analytical skills on supporting our established methodologies rather than trying to replace them." Patricia closed her folder. The message was clear. Conform or be excluded. Fall in line or be marginalized. Accept the limitations of conventional thinking or be labeled a problem. What happened next wasn't immediately obvious. There was no formal meeting, no explicit orders, no documentation trail. But within 48 hours, Patricia began experiencing what military personnel euphemistically called administrative friction. Her access to certain intelligence databases suddenly required additional authorization that took days to process. Requests for computational resources were denied due to system maintenance that never seemed to end. Her analytical reports were returned for format corrections that required complete rewrites according to constantly changing specifications. Captain Walsh began scheduling Patricia for additional administrative duties that consumed hours she normally spent on analysis. Equipment inspections, supply inventory, base security walkthroughs, busy work designed to keep her away from intelligence gathering. When Patricia pointed out that these duties weren't part of her military occupational specialty, she was reminded that flexibility and adaptability were essential military virtues. The subtle sabotage extended beyond administrative barriers. Her workstation was relocated to a corner of the ISA building, where Wi-Fi signals were weak and power fluctuations were common. Her requests for specialized software were denied due to budget constraints, despite knowing that far more expensive equipment could have been approved for other analysts without question. Her personal laptop was flagged during a routine security inspection and confiscated for compliance review, a process that could take weeks or months. Sergeant Reeves took to openly mocking her analytical methods during briefings. "Hey, numbers, what do your magic algorithms say about tomorrow's weather? Should we consult your crystal ball before planning operations?" The comments always drew laughs from other personnel, creating an atmosphere where questioning Patricia's competence became acceptable, even encouraged. But the most insidious barrier was informational isolation. Patricia discovered that critical intelligence briefings were being held without her knowledge. Key personnel meetings were scheduled during her assigned administrative duties. Important communications were distributed to essential personnel only, a category that somehow never included her despite her analytical responsibilities. She began arriving at work to find that significant developments had occurred overnight. Decisions had been made, operations had been planned, all without any input from the ISA's most capable analyst. When she asked about being excluded, she was told that her specialized focus made her participation unnecessary for broader strategic discussions. The isolation was professionally devastating and personally crushing. Patricia found herself cut off from the information streams she needed to perform her job effectively. Her algorithms required current data to maintain accuracy, but that data was increasingly difficult to access. Her predictive models needed validation against real-world outcomes, but she was no longer included in operational planning where those validations could occur. Major Harrison began treating her like a dangerous liability rather than a valuable asset. During the few briefings she was allowed to attend, he would preemptively dismiss any analytical contributions she attempted to make. Lieutenant Chen's theoretical approach became shorthand for impractical, unreliable, or irrelevant. Her insights were categorized as academic exercises rather than operational intelligence. The psychological pressure was relentless. Patricia discovered that questioning conventional wisdom wasn't just discouraged, it was treated as a form of organizational betrayal. Her mathematical certainty was reframed as arrogance. Her analytical precision was characterized as inflexibility. Her pattern recognition capabilities were dismissed as overthinking. She began eating alone in the mess hall, working alone in her corner workstation, walking the base perimeter alone during her off-duty hours. Other personnel treated her with the careful distance reserved for someone who had been unofficially marked as problematic. Conversations stopped when she approached. Invitations to informal gatherings dried up. She became a ghost in her own unit. The most frustrating aspect was that her exclusion coincided with a series of intelligence failures that her methods could have prevented. An IED attack that killed 2 soldiers occurred at a location her algorithms had flagged as high risk. A supply convoy was ambushed along a route her pattern analysis had identified compromised. A forward observation post was overrun during a time window her predictive models had calculated as maximum vulnerability. Each failure validated her methodologies while simultaneously reinforcing her isolation. The conventional intelligence approach continued producing inadequate results, but admitting Patricia's alternative analysis was superior would require acknowledging that the entire ISA had been operating with compromised effectiveness. Easier to exclude the dissenting voice than confront the implications of her success. Patricia realized she was facing a choice that extended far beyond her military career. She could accept marginalization in exchange for professional survival, conforming to limitations that guaranteed suboptimal outcomes. Or she could continue developing her capabilities despite institutional resistance, knowing that her persistence would be interpreted as insubordination. The decision became clear when she intercepted communications suggesting another major insurgent operation in planning. Her algorithms identified preparation markers for an attack that could potentially kill dozens of American soldiers. Her predictive models indicated timing, location, and methodology with mathematical precision that surpassed anything conventional intelligence had achieved. But she no longer had official channels for presenting her analysis. Her access to operational planning had been severed. Her credibility had been systematically undermined. Her warnings would be dismissed as more theoretical speculation from someone whose judgment had been officially questioned. Patricia understood that she was about to face the most difficult decision of her military career. She could remain silent and watch preventable casualties occur, or she could find unofficial ways to act on information that could save lives. The first option preserved her career, but violated her fundamental oath to protect American forces. The second option would likely end her military service, but honored her deeper commitment to preventing unnecessary deaths. The systematic opposition she faced wasn't just about challenging her analytical methods or questioning her competence. It was about maintaining an institutional culture that valued conformity over effectiveness, tradition over innovation, conventional wisdom over mathematical certainty. But, as Patricia would soon discover, sometimes the most important battles require abandoning official channels and taking personal responsibility for outcomes that official channels cannot achieve. Sometimes protecting American lives requires violating institutional expectations. And sometimes the greatest service to one's country involves acts that one's superiors will never understand or appreciate. The next phase of her story would test whether mathematical certainty could overcome institutional inertia, whether individual courage could challenge systemic resistance, and whether the American military could adapt quickly enough to save the lives of soldiers who didn't even know existed. The night shift at Forward Operating Base Sentinel carried a different quality of silence than the day. Without the constant movement of personnel, vehicles, and aircraft, the base settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the distant hum of generators and the occasional radio check from perimeter guards. It was during these hollow hours that Patricia Chen did her most important work, hunched over a borrowed laptop in an unused storage room she'd converted into an unofficial analytical sanctuary. 3 weeks had passed since her official marginalization began, and Patricia had adapted to operating in the shadows of the intelligence community she'd once hoped to revolutionize. Her original workstation sat empty most days, occasionally occupied by temporary personnel who used it for basic administrative tasks. Her security clearances remained technically valid, but accessing sensitive databases now required justifications that were routinely denied or delayed beyond operational relevance. So Patricia had learned to work with fragments. Her new methodology involved collecting intelligence scraps that fell through the cracks of official channels, discarded intercept transcripts that others considered irrelevant, routing administrative messages that contained operational details, maintenance reports from electronic warfare units that revealed patterns in enemy communications behavior, personnel transfer orders that indicated shifting priorities, even mess hall conversations that provided context for formal briefings she was no longer allowed to attend. The storage room had become her clandestine operations center. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, filled with printed materials she'd accumulated over months of systematic information gathering. A hand-drawn map of the local area covered one wall, marked with colored pins representing data points that painted a picture invisible to conventional analysis. Multiple notebooks contained handwritten calculations, algorithmic formulas, and pattern observations that existed nowhere in official files. Her borrowed laptop, an aging machine acquired through unofficial channels, ran software she'd coded herself during countless off-duty hours. Without access to the ISA's computational resources, Patricia had learned to write extremely efficient algorithms that could process massive data sets on minimal hardware. Her code was elegant in its necessity, streamlined by the constraints of working entirely outside official support systems. The insurgent operation she'd identified was larger and more sophisticated than anything previously detected. Her analysis suggested a coordinated attack involving multiple cells, targeting several American installations simultaneously. The mathematical models indicated planning complexity that required months of preparation and resources that suggested external support from experienced military professionals. But Patricia's warnings had been not just ignored, they'd been actively suppressed. Captain Walsh had been explicit during their last official interaction. "Lieutenant Chen, your continued focus on unauthorized analytical projects is becoming a disciplinary issue. You will confine your activities to assigned duties and cease all independent intelligence gathering immediately." The order was both legally binding and operationally catastrophic. Following it would prevent Patricia from tracking the emerging threat. Violating it would constitute direct insubordination with career-ending consequences. Patricia had chosen a third option: technical compliance with practical resistance. She'd ceased all independent intelligence gathering using official resources. Instead, she'd moved her operations entirely into personal time using personal equipment and publicly available information. Her analysis now relied on open-source materials, social media monitoring, and pattern recognition applied to information that technically wasn't classified. The legal gray area allowed her to continue working while maintaining plausible deniability. The isolation had become total. Patricia ate meals at odd hours to avoid awkward encounters with colleagues who'd been instructed to limit their interactions with her. She slept irregularly, often working through the night and catching brief naps during the day when the storage room was least likely to be disturbed. Her personal communications with family had dwindled to brief, carefully worded emails that revealed nothing about her professional situation. The psychological toll was severe. Patricia had entered military service believing her exceptional capabilities would be valued and utilized for the greater good. Instead, she discovered that exceptional capabilities were often viewed as threats to institutional stability. Her mathematical precision challenged conventional wisdom. Her analytical methods exposed the limitations of traditional approaches, and her success highlighted the inadequacies of established procedures. The military, she realized, was designed to transform individual capabilities into collective effectiveness. But that transformation required conformity to proven methods, acceptance of hierarchical decision-making, and subordination of personal insights to institutional knowledge. Patricia's capabilities were too individualistic, too revolutionary, too disruptive to existing power structures. Yet the emerging threat demanded exactly the kind of analytical sophistication that only she possessed. The conventional intelligence apparatus at Forward Operating Base Sentinel was operating with the equivalent of medieval tools while facing an enemy that employed modern asymmetric warfare techniques. The insurgents had learned to exploit the predictable patterns of American intelligence gathering, staying one step ahead of methodologies that relied on human sources, satellite surveillance, and traditional signals intercept. Patricia's algorithms, by contrast, analyzed the enemy's adaptive behavior as a complex system that could be understood mathematically. Her models incorporated variables that conventional analysis ignored, economic pressures that influence operational timing, social dynamics that affected recruitment patterns, psychological factors that shape decision-making under stress, technological limitations that constrained communication options. The result was analytical precision that approached clairvoyance. Patricia could predict not just what the enemy would do, but when they would do it, how they would do it, and why conventional countermeasures would fail. Her mathematical models had achieved something unprecedented in military intelligence: reliable forecast accuracy for asymmetric threats. But that capability existed only in the mind of someone who had been professionally isolated, personally marginalized, and institutionally rejected. The irony was crushing. The American military possessed the most sophisticated intelligence analyst in its history, someone whose capabilities could revolutionize counterinsurgency operations and save countless lives. Yet organizational dynamics had rendered those capabilities not just unused, but actively suppressed. Patricia understood that she was living through a systemic failure that extended far beyond her personal situation. The military's inability to recognize and integrate exceptional capabilities represented a fundamental flaw in how modern warfare was conducted. While enemies adapt rapidly to new threats and opportunities, institutional resistance to unconventional approaches creates dangerous blind spots that hostile forces could exploit. The emerging attack she'd identified was exactly the kind of threat that conventional intelligence would fail to detect until too late. The insurgents were using communication methods that bypassed traditional intercept capabilities, coordination techniques that avoided established surveillance patterns, and timing strategies that exploited known vulnerabilities in American operational cycles. Patricia's analysis indicated the attack would occur during a specific 4-hour window when base security was transitionally vulnerable due to shift changes. The targets would be selected to maximize psychological impact while minimizing tactical risk to the attackers. The methodology would involve weapons and techniques designed to overwhelm American response capabilities through simultaneous multi-vector assault. Her mathematical models predicted casualties in the double digits unless preventive action was taken within the next 72 hours. But Patricia no longer had any official mechanism for communicating this information. Her access to operational planning had been severed. Her credibility had been systematically undermined. Her analytical reports were automatically flagged for review that effectively prevented them from reaching decision-makers. She faced a choice that transcended military protocol and entered the realm of moral obligation. She could respect institutional boundaries and watch preventable casualties occur, or she could violate those boundaries and accept personal consequences while potentially saving American lives. The decision was complicated by the knowledge that any unauthorized action on her part would be interpreted as confirmation of the concerns that had led to her isolation. If she circumvented official channels to warn about the impending attack, she would be characterized as an unstable analyst who had become dangerously obsessed with unauthorized intelligence activities. Her warnings would be dismissed as the fantasies of someone's judgment had already been questioned.
Yet the mathematical certainty of her analysis left no room for doubt. The attack would occur. American soldiers would die. The conventional intelligence apparatus would be caught completely unprepared because they were using analytical methods that were fundamentally inadequate for the threat they faced. Patricia realized she was confronting a test that would define not just her military career, but her fundamental identity as a protector of American lives. The oath she'd taken when accepting her commission had been to support and defend the Constitution, but it had also included an implicit commitment to protecting the soldiers who served alongside her. That commitment now required choosing between institutional loyalty and operational effectiveness, between personal safety and moral obligation, between following orders and saving lives. The storage room's fluorescent light flickered intermittently, casting unsteady shadows across her hand-drawn maps and calculated predictions. Outside, Forward Operating Base Sentinel continued its routine operations, unaware that one of the most significant threats in its operational history was approaching with mathematical inevitability. Patricia stared at her laptop screen, where countdown timers displayed the remaining time before her predicted attack window. 68 hours and 37 minutes until American soldiers would face an assault that only she had seen coming. 68 hours and 37 minutes to decide whether mathematical certainty was worth sacrificing everything she'd worked to achieve. The isolation was complete, but the responsibility remained absolute. Patricia Chen, the analyst who had been systematically excluded from the intelligence community, was the only person who could prevent a catastrophe that no one else would see coming until it was too late. Her next decision would determine whether exceptional capabilities could overcome institutional inertia, whether individual courage could challenge systemic failure, and whether one person's mathematical certainty was worth risking everything to protect soldiers who would never know how close they'd come to dying. The alarm pierced through Forward Operating Base Sentinel at 0347 hours with the shrill urgency of imminent catastrophe. Patricia Chen bolted upright in her bunk, instantly awake despite having slept only 90 minutes. Her internal clock, calibrated by weeks of tracking the emerging threat, told her this was 12 hours earlier than her mathematical models had predicted. Something had accelerated the insurgent timeline. Emergency lighting bathed the barracks in hellish red as personnel scrambled into gear. The base-wide announcement crackled through speakers with controlled panic. All personnel to defensive positions. The base is under coordinated attack. This is not a drill. Patricia grabbed her tactical vest and weapon, but her mind was already racing through the analytical implications. Early execution suggested either external pressure forcing premature action or intelligence indicating their operation had been compromised. Neither scenario matched her algorithmic predictions, which meant variables she hadn't accounted for were now driving events. The ISA building was in chaos when she arrived. Analysts hunched over terminals trying to piece together real-time intelligence while explosions thundered across the base perimeter. Major Harrison stood at the central console, barking orders into multiple radio handsets while studying a tactical display that showed red icons multiplying across the base's defensive grid. "Sir," Sergeant Reeves called out, his usual mockery replaced by professional urgency. "We've got simultaneous breaches at gates 3 and 7. Secondary explosions suggest coordinated sapper teams. This isn't random harassment. They're executing a planned assault." Patricia slipped into the ISA building through a side entrance, her mind automatically cataloging the attack patterns visible through the windows. The insurgents were using precisely the methodology her analysis had predicted. Multiple penetration points designed to overwhelm defensive responses, coordinated timing to maximize confusion, secondary explosions to disrupt command and control. But the early timeline meant something had changed in the insurgent operational calculus. "We need a pattern analysis on their assault vectors," Harrison was saying into his radio. "Intelligence indicates this is bigger than standard harassment. Get me predictive data on their next moves." Patricia realized she was witnessing the exact scenario her algorithms had been designed to address. The conventional intelligence apparatus was reacting to events as they unfolded, rather than anticipating them. They were analyzing what had already happened instead of predicting what would happen next. In asymmetric warfare, that reactive approach guaranteed they would always be one step behind. Her personal tablet, tucked inside her tactical vest, contained real-time updates from the monitoring systems she'd established during her isolation. While the official intelligence community scrambled to understand the attack, Patricia's algorithms were already processing the patterns and updating their predictions. The data revealed a devastating reality. This was only the first phase. Her models indicated the initial assault was designed to draw defensive resources toward the perimeter breaches, while a secondary team infiltrate through a completely different vector. The real target wasn't the base's defensive positions, it was the communications array that coordinated air support. Destroying that array would leave the base isolated and vulnerable to the primary assault, which would come from the direction everyone least expected. Patricia faced the moment she'd been dreading for weeks. She possessed information that could save dozens of lives, but communicating that information would require violating every protocol that had governed her isolation. She could remain silent and preserve her career while watching preventable casualties occur, or she could act on her analysis and accept the consequences. The decision lasted approximately 2 seconds. "Major Harrison," she said, stepping toward the central console with her tablet in hand. He turned with the expression of someone discovering a cockroach in his morning coffee. "Lieutenant Chen, you're not authorized in this area during combat operations. Return to your assigned position immediately." "Sir, I have predictive data on the attack vectors. The perimeter breaches are diversions. The real assault—" "Numbers," Reeves interrupted, his voice carrying stress-induced anger. "We don't have time for your theoretical bullshit right now. We're dealing with actual combat." Patricia held up her tablet, displaying a tactical map overlaid with probability matrices that showed the insurgents' most likely next moves. "Sir, they're targeting the communications array. The secondary team is approaching from the southeast, using the cover of the primary assault to mask their infiltration. They'll reach the array in approximately 18 minutes unless we redirect defensive assets." Lieutenant stared at her with undisguised hostility. "Lieutenant, you've been explicitly ordered to cease unauthorized intelligence activities. Your presence here during combat operations is—" The base shuddered as another explosion ripped through the perimeter defenses. Radio chatter filled the air with reports of casualties, equipment failures, and deteriorating defensive positions. In the background, Patricia could hear the steady approach of small arms fire as insurgent assault teams advanced through the outer security zones. "Major," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos with mathematical certainty, "my analysis shows 97.3% probability that the communications array will be destroyed within the next 20 minutes unless immediate action is taken. After that, we lose air support coordination and the primary assault begins from grid reference 347-229. Captain Walsh appeared at Harrison's shoulder, her face flushed with combat stress and administrative outrage. "Sir, Lieutenant Chen has been explicitly ordered to confine her activities to assigned duties. Her continued insubordination during combat operations constitutes—" A massive explosion shook the building so violently that ceiling tiles rained down on the analysts. The tactical display flickered and went dark for several seconds before emergency power restored partial functionality. When the screens came back online, new red icons appeared across the base's defensive grid. "Communications array is under direct assault," a voice crackled through the radio. "Request immediate reinforcement. Multiple hostiles approaching from—" Signal breaking up. "Say again. Losing comms." Patricia watched the blood drain from Harrison's face as he realized the implications. Without the communications array, Forward Operating Base Sentinel would lose its ability to coordinate air support, request reinforcement, or maintain contact with higher command. The base would become an isolated target vulnerable to sustained assault. "Sir," Patricia said quietly, "grid reference 347-229. The primary assault team is positioned there now. They're waiting for the communications array to go down before launching the main attack. We have approximately 14 minutes to disrupt their position before they advance. Harrison stared at her tablet screen, where her algorithmic predictions displayed insurgent positions with precision that surpassed anything conventional intelligence had achieved. The mathematical models showed not just where the enemy was, but where they would be, what they would do next, and when they would do it. "How do you know this?" he asked, his voice carrying a mixture of desperation and disbelief. Pattern analysis of their communication methods, timing coordination between assault teams, tactical doctrine based on previous operations, resource allocation patterns, psychological profiles of known commanders, mathematical modeling of optimal assault strategies given current conditions. The data converges on a single most probable scenario. Another radio transmission crackled through the speakers. "Communications array is heavy fire, taking casualties, won't hold position much longer." Harrison looked at Patricia's tablet, then at the tactical display, showing American defensive positions being systematically overwhelmed. The conventional intelligence apparatus had provided no warning about the assault, no prediction about insurgent tactics, no insight into their operational planning. They were fighting blind against an enemy that had planned for every contingency except mathematical analysis. "Reeves," Harrison barked, redirected 3rd Squad to grid reference 347-229, full combat load, immediate displacement. "Sir, that position shows no enemy activity on our surveillance." "Do it now." Harrison's voice carried the authority of someone whose career was disintegrating in real time. "And get me a fire mission on those coordinates, danger close if necessary." Patricia felt a surge of professional vindication mixed with personal terror. Her analysis was finally being acted upon, but only because conventional methods had failed so completely the desperate alternatives seemed reasonable. She wasn't being trusted, she was being gambled on. The next few minutes would determine whether mathematical certainty could overcome tactical uncertainty, whether algorithmic precision could substitute for traditional intelligence gathering, and whether one analyst's isolated work could save a base that had systematically excluded her from its defense planning. "Lieutenant Chen," Harrison said without looking at her, "you will remain in this operations center and provide real-time analysis as events develop. Your methods appear to be our best option for anticipating enemy actions." The admission cost him something fundamental. Patricia could see the institutional pride cracking as he acknowledged that his conventional intelligence apparatus had been outperformed by someone he'd spent weeks marginalizing. But professional survival required adapting, and the reality was that Patricia's mathematical models were proving more accurate than anything else available. Radio chatter filled the air as 3rd Squad moved toward the coordinates Patricia had identified. Artillery requests went out for fire missions on positions that conventional surveillance hadn't detected. Air support was diverted from reactive targets to predictive ones based on algorithmic analysis rather than visual confirmation. For the first time in her military career, Patricia Chen was being listened to not despite her unconventional methods, but because of them. The crisis had created conditions where mathematical certainty became more valuable than institutional conformity, where analytical precision trumped traditional wisdom, where being right mattered more than being conventional. But the test was far from over. The insurgents had planned their operation with sophistication that suggests professional military training and extensive intelligence gathering. They expected American forces to react predictably to conventional assault patterns. Patricia's algorithmic intervention had disrupted their operational assumptions, but adaptive enemies could adjust their tactics in real time. The next phase would determine whether disrupting the insurgents' initial plan would be sufficient to defeat their overall operation, or whether her mathematical models would need to stay ahead of an enemy that was learning to account for analytical capabilities they hadn't previously encountered. As explosions continued to rock forward operating base Sentinel and radio reports painted an increasingly desperate tactical picture, Patricia realized she was no longer fighting just for professional recognition or personal vindication. She was fighting to prove that exceptional analytical capabilities could change the fundamental dynamics of modern warfare, that mathematical precision could overcome institutional limitation, and that sometimes the most important battles are won not with weapons, but with the courage to trust unconventional wisdom when conventional wisdom fails completely.
The crisis had only just begun. The radio crackled with Third Squad's tense voice cutting through the chaos. Overwatch, this is Hunter 3. We've got visual on multiple hostiles at grid 347229. How did you know they were here? It's like you could see through the mountain. Patricia's fingers flew across her tablet, updating her algorithmic models with real-time battlefield data. The confirmation of insurgent positions at her predicted coordinates had transformed the ISA Operations Center from chaos into focused intensity. Major Harrison stood behind her now, watching her screen with the fascination of someone witnessing magic performed through mathematics. Hunter 3, this is Overwatch, Harrison responded in his headset. Maintain observation. Do not engage until we have a complete tactical picture. We need to know if this is their full strength or if additional units are positioned elsewhere. Patricia's analysis was already 3 steps ahead. Her models indicated the insurgents had planned for the possibility of their secondary position being discovered, which meant they had contingency protocols ready to execute. But contingency protocols followed predictable patterns based on tactical doctrine, resource limitations, and communication constraints. Major, she said without looking up from her calculations, they're going to execute Protocol 7 Alpha within the next 4 minutes. 2-person teams will split off from the main group and establish Overwatch positions on these ridgelines. She highlighted 3 terrain features on her tactical display. The remaining assault team will attempt to flank Hunter 3's position using this ravine system. Harrison stared at the predicted movement patterns displayed on her screen. How can you possibly know their tactical protocols? Communication pattern analysis over the past 6 months, cross-referenced with tactical manuals captured from previous operations, psychological profiling of known commanders, mathematical modeling of optimal movement strategies given current terrain constraints, Patricia explained while her algorithms processed new data streams. Captain Walsh approached with an expression that mixed professional curiosity with institutional discomfort. Lieutenant Chen, are you suggesting you can predict enemy tactical movements in real time? Not suggested. Demonstrate. Patricia pointed to her screen where countdown timers tracked the probability windows for each predicted action. Protocol 7 Alpha execution in 3 minutes 17 seconds. Split team movements beginning in 4 minutes 43 seconds, flanking maneuver initiation in 6 minutes 12 seconds. The operations center had gone silent except for the electronic hum of equipment and distant explosions. Every analyst was staring at Patricia's display, watching mathematical predictions unfold with precision that defied conventional intelligence-gathering methods. "Sir," Sergeant Reeves said, his voice carrying none of its usual mockery, "if Lieutenant Chen is right about their tactical responses, we can position our forces to intercept them before they execute. We could turn their own protocols against them." Harrison nodded slowly, the implications becoming clear. Traditional intelligence gathering was reactive. It analyzed what the enemy had already done. Patricia's algorithmic approach was predictive. It anticipated what the enemy would do next. In fast-moving tactical situations, that difference wasn't just advantageous, it was revolutionary. "Hunter 3, this is Overwatch," Harrison transmitted. "Be advised, enemy forces will likely split into smaller elements within the next 3 minutes. Expect 2-person teams to establish Overwatch positions on ridgelines bearing 127 and 284 degrees from your current position. The main assault element will attempt a flanking maneuver through the ravine system to your northeast." The radio response came immediately. "Overwatch, how do you have intelligence on enemy intentions? Are you tracking their communications?" Patricia was already working on the next phase of her analysis. The insurgents' operational planning included multiple contingency layers, each designed to respond to different levels of American tactical awareness. By demonstrating knowledge of their immediate tactical intentions, American forces had revealed capabilities the insurgents hadn't anticipated. "Major, they're going to adapt," she said, highlighting new probability matrices on her screen. "Their communications will shift to predetermined backup frequencies.
Command protocols will revert to simplified hand signals. They'll assume their tactical communications have been compromised and adjust accordingly. Can you track their adaptations? Patricia's smile was grim. Their adaptations follow mathematical patterns too. Backup communication frequencies are chosen based on equipment limitations and signal propagation characteristics. Hand signal protocols are constrained by line-of-sight requirements and message complexity. Even their adaptations can be predicted if you understand the underlying variables. Her tablet chimed softly as new data streams updated her models. The insurgents were indeed shifting to backup communications, exactly as her algorithms had predicted. But Patricia's analysis went deeper than communication methods. It incorporated psychological factors, resource constraints, terrain limitations, and tactical doctrine to build comprehensive behavioral models. "Sir, they're about to discover that Hunter 3 has been reinforced," she announced. "When they do, they'll immediately abort the flanking maneuver and execute Emergency Protocol 3 Charlie. Full withdrawal to predetermined rally point 2.3 kilometers northeast of current position." Harrison looked at his tactical display, then at Patricia's algorithmic predictions. "Are you certain?" 97.8% probability, but we can increase that certainty to 99.4% by introducing a specific stimulus. Patricia highlighted a section of terrain on her screen. "If we position Apache 2 at these coordinates and maintain radio silence, the insurgents will interpret the movement as evidence of additional American forces they hadn't detected. That will trigger their withdrawal protocol immediately." The operations center buzzed with activity as Harrison coordinated movements based on Patricia's mathematical predictions. Apache 2 was redirected to the specified coordinates. Hunter 3 maintained observation of insurgent positions while additional units moved to intercept anticipated withdrawal routes. "This is incredible," Captain Walsh murmured, watching Patricia's real-time analysis update continuously. "You're essentially reading their minds through mathematics." "Not mind reading," Patricia corrected, her fingers never pausing on the keyboard. "Pattern recognition applied to behavioral prediction. Human decision-making follows mathematical patterns when constrained by tactical requirements, resource limitations, and time pressure. The insurgents think they're making independent choices, but they're actually following algorithmic paths determined by their training, equipment, and operational objectives." The radio crackled with Hunter 3's voice. "Overwatch, enemy forces are withdrawing, moving northeast in tactical formation exactly as predicted." "How is this possible?" Patricia was already tracking the withdrawal, her models predicting movement speeds, route selections, and rally point options. But she was also analyzing something more significant: the insurgents' growing awareness that American forces possessed unprecedented intelligence capabilities. "Major, we have a strategic decision point," she announced. "The insurgents are beginning to understand that their tactical patterns have been compromised. Their next operation will incorporate countermeasures designed to defeat algorithmic analysis. We can either pursue the current tactical advantage or preserve our analytical capabilities for future operations." Harrison paused, recognizing the implications. Pressing the current advantage would reveal the full extent of Patricia's analytical capabilities to the enemy, potentially compromising future operations. But allowing the insurgents to escape would waste an opportunity to eliminate a significant threat.
What do you recommend, Lieutenant? Patricia's analysis was already complete. Pursue to point Delta 7, then allow controlled escape. We eliminate approximately 60% of their operational capability while preserving the appearance that our intelligence came from traditional sources. They'll assume we had human intelligence assets in place rather than algorithmic prediction. The tactical execution unfolded exactly as Patricia's models had predicted. American forces intercepted the withdrawing insurgents at predetermined locations, inflicting significant casualties while allowing core leadership to escape. To external observation, it appeared to be the result of exceptional intelligence gathering and tactical coordination rather than mathematical prediction of enemy behavior. But within the ISA Operations Center, everyone understood they had witnessed something unprecedented. Patricia Chen hadn't just provided intelligence about enemy activities, she had demonstrated the ability to predict enemy decisions with mathematical precision in real-time tactical situations. "Lieutenant Chen," Harrison said as the immediate crisis concluded,
I owe you an apology and an explanation to my superiors about how we've been underutilizing our most valuable analytical asset. Patricia closed her laptop and looked around the operations center where she'd been systematically excluded for weeks. The same analysts who had mocked her theoretical approaches were now staring at her with expressions that mixed professional respect with uncomfortable recognition of their own limitations. "Sir, the algorithmic approach isn't a replacement for conventional intelligence gathering," she said carefully. "It's an enhancement. Mathematical analysis can predict patterns that human intelligence can't detect, but it requires the kind of comprehensive data that only conventional methods can provide." The diplomatic response was calculated to preserve institutional dignity while establishing her analytical methods as complementary rather than threatening. But everyone in the room understood that they had just witnessed capabilities that transcended conventional intelligence gathering entirely. Sergeant Reeves approached hesitantly. "Numbers, Lieutenant Chen, what you just did was—" He struggled for words. "I've never seen anything like that in 15 years of intelligence work." Patricia realized that her call sign had just evolved from mockery to recognition. Numbers was no longer an insult suggesting someone who dealt in abstractions. It had become an acknowledgement of someone who can transform mathematical analysis into tactical advantage. "The enemy will adapt," she warned. "They'll develop countermeasures designed to defeat algorithmic prediction. Our advantage is temporary unless we continue developing more sophisticated analytical methods." But as Patricia looked around the operations center where she was finally being recognized for her true capabilities, she understood that she had accomplished something more significant than tactical victory. She had demonstrated that exceptional analytical capabilities could overcome institutional resistance, that mathematical certainty could triumph over conventional wisdom, and that sometimes the most important breakthroughs require abandoning established methods entirely. The systematic opposition she had faced hadn't just been about questioning her competence or challenging her methods. It had been about preserving institutional culture that valued conformity over innovation, tradition over effectiveness, conventional wisdom over revolutionary insight. But the crisis had created conditions where performance mattered more than conformity, where results trumped tradition, where being right became more important than being conventional. Patricia's breakthrough hadn't just saved American lives. It had proven that exceptional capabilities, when finally recognized and properly utilized, could transform the fundamental dynamics of modern warfare. The real test would be whether that recognition would survive the return to routine operations, or whether institutional culture would reassert itself once the immediate crisis had passed. 6 months later, the secure briefing room at the Pentagon hummed with the quiet intensity of military leadership confronting a paradigm shift. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Chen stood at the head of a polished conference table, her uniform bearing the silver oak leaves that reflected a meteoric rise through ranks previously unimaginable for someone who had been systematically marginalized just months earlier. The audience represented the highest levels of military intelligence: generals, admirals, deputy directors, and senior analysts who had spent decades mastering conventional approaches to asymmetric warfare. They sat in uncomfortable silence as Patricia's presentation dismantled everything they thought they knew about predictive intelligence gathering. The Afghan operation demonstrated that algorithmic behavioral analysis can achieve tactical prediction accuracy rates exceeding 97% in real-time combat situations, Patricia explained. Her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone's mathematical certainty had been validated by battlefield results. But more significantly, it revealed that our enemy's adaptive capabilities follow mathematical patterns that can be anticipated and countered. Her presentation screen displayed a global map overlaid with probability matrices and predictive models that extended far beyond the mountains of Afghanistan. Red zones indicated regions where insurgent activities could be forecast with unprecedented precision. Blue zones showed areas where American forces could achieve tactical advantage through algorithmic intelligence gathering. Yellow zones highlighted emerging threats that conventional analysis had missed entirely. General Rebecca Martinez, the deputy director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, leaned forward with the expression of someone grappling with implications that extend beyond military applications. Colonel Chen, you're suggesting that human behavior in warfare is fundamentally predictable through mathematical analysis? Not all human behavior, ma'am, but tactical decision-making under stress, constrained by resource limitations and doctrine requirements, follows patterns that can be modeled mathematically. The key is comprehensive data integration across multiple variables that conventional analysis treats as separate factors. Patricia touched her tablet, and the presentation shifted to show comparison charts that told a devastating story. Conventional intelligence methods achieved prediction accuracy rates between 23% and 41% for insurgent activities. Patricia's algorithmic approach had demonstrated sustained accuracy rates above 94% across multiple operational theaters. The implications extend beyond tactical applications, she continued. If we can predict enemy behavior patterns, we can also predict the effectiveness of our own countermeasures. We can model the long-term consequences of strategic decisions. We can optimize resource allocation for maximum operational impact. Admiral James Thompson, whose submarine warfare experience had taught him to value technological advantage, studied the data with professional fascination. Colonel, what prevents hostile forces from developing similar capabilities? Patricia's smile was grim. Nothing, sir, which is why we need to accelerate development and deployment before our enemies realize what's possible. Mathematical analysis doesn't respect national borders or ideological commitments. Whoever masters these techniques first will possess decisive advantages in modern warfare. The room erupted in quiet discussion as senior leaders absorbed the implications. Patricia's breakthrough hadn't just proven the value of algorithmic intelligence gathering. It had revealed a new domain of warfare where mathematical sophistication could determine strategic outcomes. But the transformation hadn't been limited to tactical applications. Forward Operating Base Sentinel had become a testing ground for revolutionary intelligence methodologies. The storage room where Patricia had conducted her isolated analysis had been converted into a state-of-the-art computational center staffed by hand-picked analysts trained in her techniques. Major Harrison, now Colonel Harrison, supervised what had become the military's most successful counterinsurgency intelligence operation. The Numbers Protocol, as it had become known throughout the intelligence community, represented more than analytical advancement. It symbolized institutional willingness to embrace exceptional capabilities regardless of how those capabilities challenged established methods. Patricia's former colleagues had adapted to the new reality with varying degrees of success. Sergeant Reeves, now Staff Sergeant Reeves, had become one of her most effective students, his practical experience complementing her theoretical frameworks. Captain Walsh had requested transfer to a conventional intelligence unit where traditional methods remained dominant, unable to adapt to analytical approaches that made her own expertise seem obsolete. But the most significant transformation had occurred within Patricia herself. The isolation and systematic opposition she'd endured had taught her something more valuable than mathematical precision: the importance of institutional change management. Revolutionary capabilities meant nothing if they couldn't be integrated into existing organizational structures. Exceptional insights were worthless if they couldn't be communicated to people whose careers depend on conventional approaches. The Afghan model is now being replicated in 17 operational theaters, Patricia announced to the Pentagon briefing room. Each deployment incorporates lessons learned from previous applications while adapting to regional variables and threat characteristics. The results have been consistently superior to conventional intelligence methods. General Martinez nodded slowly. Colonel Chen, what's your assessment of scalability? Can these methods be applied to strategic-level planning? Patricia had been hoping for exactly that question. Her algorithmic approaches weren't limited to tactical applications. They could be extended to predict political stability, economic trends, social movements, and technological developments that shape strategic environments. Ma'am, my preliminary analysis suggests mathematical modeling can be applied to virtually any decision-making process, constrained by resource limitations and time pressure. Political leadership, economic policy, diplomatic negotiations, alliance relationships all follow patterns that can be predicted mathematically if you have sufficient data and appropriate analytical frameworks. The implications were staggering. Patricia wasn't just proposing improvements to military intelligence gathering, she was suggesting mathematical approaches to statecraft itself. But she had learned to present revolutionary concepts incrementally, allowing institutional culture to adapt gradually rather than demanding immediate acceptance of paradigm shift. The opposition she'd faced at Forward Operating Base Sentinel had taught her that exceptional capabilities require exceptional diplomacy. However, she continued carefully, implementation requires significant cultural adaptation within existing intelligence structures. Traditional analysts need retraining. Conventional methodologies need integration with algorithmic approaches. Command structures need modification to accommodate mathematical prediction. Admiral Thompson understood the subtext. You're describing institutional transformation, not just technological advancement. Yes, sir. Mathematical analysis reveals patterns in organizational behavior, too. Institutions resist change that threatens established hierarchies or challenges conventional wisdom. Successful implementation requires managing those resistance patterns as carefully as analyzing enemy behavior. Patricia's presentation concluded with recommendations that balanced revolutionary potential with institutional reality. Gradual expansion of algorithmic capabilities, comprehensive training programs for existing personnel, integration protocols that preserved valuable aspects of conventional analysis while incorporating mathematical enhancement. The briefing room fell silent as senior leaders absorbed proposals that could transform American intelligence capabilities from reactive to predictive, from conventional to revolutionary, from adequate to dominant. Colonel Martinez said finally, "You've presented compelling evidence that mathematical analysis can revolutionize intelligence gathering, but you've also demonstrated something equally important. Exceptional capabilities can overcome institutional resistance when properly applied." Patricia realized that her journey from marginalized analyst to recognized expert represented more than personal vindication. It demonstrated that American military institutions, despite their preference for conventional approaches, could adapt to embrace revolutionary methodologies when those methodologies proved superior to established practices. The systematic opposition she'd faced hadn't been malicious. It had been institutional self-protection against changes that threatened established hierarchies or conventional wisdom. But the crisis had created conditions where performance trumped tradition, where results mattered more than methods, where being right became more than being conventional. 6 months later, Patricia stood in the same Afghan mountains where her analytical breakthrough had first been validated. But now she wasn't isolated in a storage room conducting unauthorized analysis. She was leading a joint task force that combined the best aspects of conventional intelligence gathering with the revolutionary potential of mathematical prediction. The enemy radio chatter that had once carried confident operational discussions now reflected uncertainty and adaptation. Insurgent commanders had learned that American forces possessed unprecedented intelligence capabilities, forcing them to modify their tactics in ways that Patricia's algorithms could predict and counter. But more significantly, American intelligence had evolved from reactive to predictive, from conventional to revolutionary, from adequate to dominant. The transformation hadn't just saved lives. It had demonstrated that exceptional capabilities, when properly recognized and integrated, could change the fundamental dynamics of modern conflict. Patricia's callsign had evolved too. She was no longer numbers, the analyst who dealt in abstractions. She had become Prophet 6, the intelligence officer whose mathematical predictions had achieved legendary status among both American forces and their enemies. The radio silence that occurred when hostile forces heard her call sign wasn't just tactical caution. It was recognition that they faced analytical capabilities that transcend conventional intelligence gathering. Patricia Chen had become something unprecedented in modern warfare, a mathematical oracle whose algorithmic insights could predict enemy behavior with accuracy that approached clairvoyance. But as Patricia looked across the Afghan landscape where conventional wisdom had once dominated operational planning, she understood that her greatest achievement wasn't mathematical precision or tactical advantage. It was proving that exceptional capabilities could overcome institutional resistance, that revolutionary approaches could be integrated into established systems, and that sometimes the most important victories are won not on battlefields, but in briefing rooms where paradigm shifts are finally accepted. The young analyst who had been mocked for her unconventional methods had become the colonel whose revolutionary insights were reshaping how America understands modern warfare. The numbers who had been systematically marginalized had become Prophet 6, whose mathematical predictions had saved countless lives and transformed military intelligence from reactive capability to predictive dominance. And in the mountains of Afghanistan, where enemy commanders now ordered radio silence at the mere mention of her call sign, Patricia Chen had achieved something more valuable than professional recognition or career advancement. She had proven that exceptional capabilities, when combined with institutional courage and personal persistence, could transform not just individual careers, but entire domains of human conflict. The mathematical certainty that had once isolated her had become the analytical foundation for American intelligence superiority. The algorithmic insights that had been dismissed as theoretical speculation had become operational reality that enemies fear and allies respect. Patricia Chen, the analyst who had been told she dealt in abstractions rather than realities, had used mathematical precision to reshape the reality of modern warfare itself.
The transformation had rippled far beyond military applications. Silicon Valley tech giants were now recruiting military intelligence analysts trained in Patricia's methodologies. Wall Street firms were adapting her algorithmic approaches to predict market volatility with unprecedented accuracy. Academic institutions were establishing entire departments dedicated to studying what scholars now called the Chen paradigm, the application of mathematical modeling to complex human behavioral systems. But perhaps the most profound impact was psychological. Patricia's breakthrough had shattered the myth that human intuition was superior to mathematical analysis in complex decision-making environments. Her success had demonstrated that properly applied algorithms could outperform even the most experienced military professionals in predicting enemy behavior, optimizing resource allocation, and identifying strategic opportunities. The Pentagon briefing room had grown quiet as senior leaders contemplating recommendations that would fundamentally alter how America approached national security. Patricia's proposals weren't incremental improvements to existing systems, they represented wholesale replacement of conventional intelligence gathering with mathematically driven predictive analysis. Colonel Chen asked General Robert Hayes, the Joint Chiefs representative for strategic planning, "What are the resource requirements for full-scale implementation of your methodologies?" Patricia had anticipated the question. Her analysis included comprehensive cost-benefit calculations that demonstrated remarkable return on investment. "Sir, initial implementation requires significant computational infrastructure and personnel retraining. However, operational efficiency gains exceed costs within 18 months. Long-term savings from preventing casualties, optimized logistics, and improved strategic planning are estimated at $47 billion annually." The numbers were staggering, but Patricia's track record made them credible. Every prediction she'd made, every operational recommendation she'd provided, every strategic assessment she'd delivered had proven more accurate than conventional alternatives. Her mathematical models hadn't just been right, they'd been spectacularly, consistently, demonstrably superior to traditional approaches. Admiral Thompson studied the implementation timeline Patricia had provided. The training requirements alone would take years to complete across all intelligence branches. "Yes, sir, which is why I've developed accelerated learning protocols based on cognitive psychology research and educational optimization theory. Traditional training programs can be compressed from months to weeks while achieving superior comprehension rates. The mathematical principles underlying effective education follow patterns similar to those governing tactical decision-making."
Patricia's presentation shifted to display learning curves that showed how mathematical approaches could optimize training itself. Her algorithms had identified the most efficient sequences for introducing complex concepts, the optimal balance between theoretical instruction and practical application, and the psychological techniques that maximized retention of analytical skills. You're suggesting that mathematical analysis can improve how we teach mathematical analysis? General Martinez asked with professional fascination. Exactly, ma'am. Recursive optimization. We use algorithmic insights to improve our ability to develop algorithmic insights. Each generation of analysts becomes more capable than the previous generation because we're mathematically optimizing the development process itself. The concept was both elegant and revolutionary. Patricia wasn't just proposing better analytical tools, she was suggesting systematic improvement of human analytical capabilities through mathematical enhancement of learning processes. The briefing concluded with authorization for expanded testing across multiple operational theaters. Patricia's methodologies would be deployed in counterterrorism operations, cyber warfare defense, strategic intelligence gathering, and diplomatic negotiations. The American military was committing to the largest analytical transformation in its history. But the most significant moment came 3 weeks later in a classified facility beneath the Virginia mountains where America's most sensitive intelligence operations were coordinated. Patricia stood before a wall-mounted display showing global threat assessments generated by her algorithmic systems. Red zones indicated emerging conflicts that conventional analysis had missed. Blue zones showed opportunities for strategic advantage that traditional intelligence hadn't identified. Director Sarah Blackwood, the head of the National Intelligence Council, studied the predictive maps with expressions that mixed professional excitement with institutional concern. Colonel Chen, you're essentially proposing that we can forecast geopolitical developments months in advance? In many cases, yes, ma'am. Political instability, economic collapse, social unrest, alliance shifts, they all follow mathematical patterns when you analyze sufficient variables across appropriate timeframes. The key is integrating data streams that conventional analysis treats as unrelated. Patricia touched her tablet and the display shifted to show a specific case study. 3 months ago, my models predicted political upheaval in Southeast Asia based on commodity price fluctuations, social media sentiment analysis, and historical precedent correlation. Traditional intelligence agencies were caught completely on guard when the government fell last week. The accuracy was unsettling. Patricia's algorithms had predicted political collapse in a stable allied nation, while conventional intelligence had reported no significant threats. Her mathematical models had identified precursor patterns that human analysts had missed entirely. The implications for American foreign policy are profound, Director Blackwood observed. If we can predict political instability, we can take preventive action. If we can forecast economic collapse, we can protect American interests. If we can anticipate alliance shifts, we can adjust our strategic positioning accordingly. Patricia nodded. But the same capabilities are available to our adversaries. Mathematical analysis doesn't respect national boundaries or ideological commitments. Whoever masters these techniques first will possess decisive advantages in strategic competition. The warning was calculated to emphasize urgency. Patricia understood that institutional resistance to revolutionary change required external pressure to overcome. The threat of adversaries developing similar capabilities would accelerate American adoption of her methodologies. 6 months later, Patricia returned to Forward Operating Base Sentinel for the final time. The facility had been transformed into a training center where military intelligence personnel learned algorithmic analysis techniques that were being deployed globally. The storage room where she'd conducted her isolated research had been converted into a shrine of sorts, a reminder that revolutionary capabilities often emerge from unexpected sources.
Colonel Harrison, now promoted to Brigadier General Harrison, met her at the helicopter landing pad. Colonel Chen, it's difficult to believe this all started with you hiding in a storage room trying to convince anyone who would listen that mathematics could predict insurgent behavior.
Patricia smiled as they walked past the ISA building where she'd been systematically marginalized just 2 years earlier. The mathematics were always correct, sir. The challenge was convincing institutional culture that mathematical certainty could be superior to conventional wisdom. The base had become a pilgrimage site for intelligence professionals worldwide. Allied nations sent their best analysts to learn Patricia's techniques. Academic researchers conducted studies on the integration of mathematical modeling with traditional intelligence gathering. Technology companies developed specialized software based on her algorithmic frameworks. But the most meaningful transformation was personal. Patricia had evolved from isolated analyst to institutional leader, from marginalized voice to recognized authority, from someone whose insights were dismissed to someone whose predictions shaped national policy. The evening before her departure, Patricia stood alone on the base perimeter where she'd walked in frustrated isolation. The Afghan mountains stretched toward the horizon, their peaks touched by starlight that had witnessed the transformation of modern warfare. In those same mountains, enemy commanders still ordered radio silence when her call sign was mentioned, not out of tactical caution, but from recognition that they faced analytical capabilities that transcended conventional intelligence gathering. Prophet 6 had become more than a call sign. It had become a symbol of mathematical precision applied to human conflict, of algorithmic insights that could predict enemy behavior with supernatural accuracy, of analytical capabilities that enemies feared and allies respected. But as Patricia prepared to return to Washington for her next assignment, establishing a new division dedicated to predictive intelligence analysis, she understood that her greatest achievement wasn't mathematical precision or tactical advantage. It was proving that exceptional capabilities, when combined with institutional courage and personal persistence, could overcome systematic opposition and transform entire domains of human activity. The young woman who had been mocked as numbers, who had been told her theoretical approaches were irrelevant to practical operations, who had been systematically excluded from the intelligence community she'd hoped to serve, had become the colonel whose mathematical insights were reshaping how America understood and responded to global threats. And in the silence that fell across enemy communications whenever her call sign was transmitted, Patricia Chen had achieved something unprecedented in modern warfare. She had become a mathematical legend whose algorithmic predictions had transcended tactical applications to become strategic reality that adversaries acknowledged and respected even as they feared its implications. The transformation was complete, but the revolution was just beginning. 3 years after her breakthrough at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, Patricia stood before the United Nations Security Council in New York, addressing an emergency session convened to discuss what diplomats euphemistically called asymmetric intelligence capabilities. The mahogany-paneled chamber buzzed with tension as representatives from 15 nations grappled with implications that extended far beyond military applications. "Distinguished delegates," Patricia began, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone whose mathematical predictions had reshaped global security calculations, "we are witnessing a new domain of international competition. Algorithmic intelligence gathering isn't just changing how we understand threats, it's changing the fundamental nature of power itself." The Russian representative, Ambassador Dmitry Volkov, leaned forward with barely concealed concern. "Colonel Chen, are you suggesting that mathematical analysis can predict the behavior of sovereign nations?" "I'm demonstrating that it already has, sir." Patricia activated the chamber's display system, showing a global map overlaid with probability matrices that had accurately forecast political upheavals, economic crises, and alliance shifts across 4 continents. The accuracy was both impressive and terrifying. Patricia's mathematical models had achieved something unprecedented in international relations: reliable prediction of geopolitical developments with precision that made traditional diplomatic intelligence gathering seem primitive by comparison. Chinese Ambassador Li Wei studied the predictive data with professional fascination. What prevents hostile actors from developing similar capabilities to target American interests? Patricia's response was calculated to emphasize both opportunity and urgency. Nothing, Ambassador Lee. Mathematical principles don't respect national boundaries or ideological commitments. The question isn't whether these capabilities will proliferate, it's whether democracies will master them before authoritarian regimes do. The implicit warning resonated throughout the chamber. Patricia's breakthrough hadn't just enhanced American intelligence gathering, it had revealed a new arena of strategic competition where mathematical sophistication could determine global influence. Secretary General Maria Santos called for a brief recess, during which diplomatic conversations buzzed with anxiety about implications that no existing treaties or international agreements had anticipated. How do you regulate algorithmic intelligence gathering? How do you verify compliance with mathematical analysis limitations? How do you prevent an intelligence arms race based on computational capabilities rather than human resources? When the session resumed, Patricia presented her most ambitious proposal yet, an international framework for algorithmic intelligence sharing that would prevent destabilizing competition while enhancing global security cooperation. The concept was revolutionary. Nations would share mathematical models and predictive insights to address transnational threats while maintaining sovereignty over national security decisions. The alternative, Patricia explained, is an intelligence Cold War where mathematical capabilities become weapons of strategic competition rather than tools of cooperative security. The proposal sparked intense debate. Traditional allies worried about sharing sensitive analytical capabilities. Developing nations questioned their ability to participate meaningfully in mathematically driven intelligence cooperation. Authoritarian regimes calculated whether algorithmic transparency would enhance or threaten their strategic positions. But Patricia's track record made her warnings impossible to ignore. Every prediction she'd made, every threat she'd highlighted, every opportunity she'd highlighted had proven more accurate than conventional alternatives. Her mathematical models had prevented conflicts, optimized humanitarian responses, and identified strategic opportunities that traditional diplomacy had missed entirely.
The United Nations session concluded with authorization for a working group to develop international protocols for algorithmic intelligence cooperation. Patricia would chair the group, making her the first military officer in history to lead diplomatic negotiations about mathematical approaches to global security. But the most profound validation came 6 months later when enemy radio intercepts revealed conversations between terrorist leaders discussing the American Oracle, whose predictions had made their operational planning impossibly difficult. They spoke of Prophet 6 with a mixture of fear and respect reserved for supernatural phenomena, acknowledging that mathematical analysis had transformed their adversary into something approaching omniscience. The intercepts revealed that insurgent groups were now spending more resources trying to defeat algorithmic prediction than executing actual operations. Patricia's mathematical models had become so accurate that enemies devoted primary effort to avoiding predictable patterns rather than achieving tactical objectives. Her analytical capabilities had fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of asymmetric warfare. On a quiet evening in her Pentagon office, Patricia reviewed global intelligence reports that painted a picture of mathematical transformation extending far beyond military applications. Financial markets now relied on algorithmic analysis derived from her methodologies. Medical researchers used her pattern recognition techniques to predict disease outbreaks. Climate scientists applied her modeling approaches to forecast environmental changes with unprecedented accuracy. The young analyst who had been mocked for believing mathematics could predict human behavior had become the architect of a new era where algorithmic insights shaped everything from military strategy to economic policy to international diplomacy. As Patricia prepared for her next challenge, establishing the world's first international center for predictive intelligence analysis, she reflected on the journey that had transformed her from numbers to Prophet 6, from isolated theorist to global revolutionary. The mathematical certainty that had once made her an institutional outcast had become the analytical foundation for a new understanding of human behavior in complex systems.
The algorithmic insights that had been dismissed as academic speculation had become operational reality that shaped global security. And in classified facilities around the world where analysts now apply her techniques to predict everything from terrorist attacks to political revolutions to economic collapses, Patricia Chen's legacy continued evolving, a testament to the transformative power of exceptional capabilities combined with unwavering persistence in the face of systematic opposition. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.